Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, in the summer of 1999, Dr. Kay Kilburn released the results of his follow-up neurological testing. And ATSDR sponsored a one-time clinical evaluation for Alberton spill victims. That summer, 3 Alberton area mothers finally meet with a Senator Max Baucus aide in Missoula, and while beseeching the senator's help, vent their anger and frustration. We now continue with Part 4, Chapters 5 and 6. Chapter 5, Chalmers. Epigraph. There was a criminal investigation opened against Steve Way and myself. The charges were that we buried this train. Chris Weiss. The sleuth pursued allegations of fraud concerning the Alberton spill. In a 1997 letter, the EPA Acting Regional Administrator Jack McGraw denied Roger Chalmers' claim that chloride, sodium hydroxide, and butane had spilled, and denied that so-called mystery car BN 561897 spilled hydrochloric acid, a chemical which Chalmers confused with caustic soda. McGraw also denied that the spill site was still contaminated and affecting residents' health, which was highly debatable. Chalmers' criminal allegations were investigated by the EPA Criminal Investigations Division's Fred Burnside, special agent in charge. In the summer of 1998, Burnside closed the case, writing Chalmers that no crimes had been committed. The public record generally supported the official story. There were also many problems with Chalmers' claims and his interpretation of evidence. After Burnside closed the criminal investigation, Chalmers complained to the EPA Washington, D.C. office. Chalmers would believe that his complaint of the CID later led to EPA Ombudsman Martin's involvement because it predated ACCEH's petition. Officially, Martin responded to ACCEH, not Chalmers. Chalmers. When Bob Martin read Burnside's report, Bob said when he read that letter, "My God, I didn't know you had letters like this. I was waiting for the right person to come along." He knew eventually the FBI or the U.S. Attorney's Office would want to see this. That's why I think there's federal crime, at the Federal Railroad level, at the EPA level, and at the ATSDR level. I know the people who came here are either criminals or they're acting off of fraudulent information, Chalmers said. Chalmers was suggesting collusion between MRL and government agencies and a broad conspiratorial cover-up of something fraudulent. Chalmers claimed that MRL's cover-up included burying certain train cars from the derailment. Chalmers got a copy of the VHS videotape that Russell Simmons shot from his house near the bottom of West Mountain Creek Road, north of the site, in 1996. The tape was difficult to watch because Simmons used no tripod and had a shaky hand. The resolution was poor as well. From May 14 to June 3rd, Simmons documented several men operating trucks, loaders, and excavators. Simmons' tape covered only about 135 minutes of activity at the site over 3 weeks. In general, the site workers appeared to move, remove, and flatten soil with their heavy machines, working without respiratory gear. The job was no mystery. Remove contaminated soil, add new soil, remove all derailment-related debris, and make repairs to the rail bed prior to laying new rail. On May 27, an excavator demolished a boxcar near Reardon Lane, and Simmons filmed as the crane removed large flat chunks. Sometime after Simmons filmed May 28 and before resuming the next day, the black gondola car to the south was removed. On May 29, Simmons watched as 2 excavators worked in tandem on another boxcar by Reardon Lane. "Beating the living bejesus out of it," Simmons commented. Within 15 minutes, they had the carcass shredded and flattened. The film ended on June 3rd, after the site had been graded. Based on his interpretation of the tape, which he reviewed with Martin, Chalmers claimed 2 derailed cars, a dried peas car and the zinc sulfate car, were buried after dismantling on the north side of the tracks on MRL property in different holes. But there was no clear evidence in the video of any metal being buried. He claimed BN 561897, The black gondola was cut into 3 pieces and buried south of the tracks, though no dismantling was shown in the video, nor any burying of it. In sum, Chalmers believed that implied digging shown in brief video scenes was proof of excavating holes and burying dismantled cars. While the damaged tankers were hauled off-site, a damaged boxcar, such as the one Simmons filmed, could be dismantled on site. Presumably, the pieces still had scrap value. It was definitely buried, Chalmers claimed, of the zinc sulfate car. They smashed the car and buried it. He believed MRL buried the ends of the dismantled cars because they carried identification numbers. Near the end of the tape, Chalmers asked Martin, "When do you want to call the FBI?" Why would MRL bury these cars anyway? MRL's William Brodsky later testified that he wasn't aware of anything being intentionally buried at the site or in the right-of-way. Ken Holgard, FRA hazmat investigator, visited Chalmers at his request in 2000, telling him it was not a typical practice to bury cars on property, but it's legal, not a DOT regulatory area. The remaining legal issue concerned potential disposal of toxic waste or of contaminated rail cars, and that practice may have had precedence with MRL. Tom Barshaw, who laid fiber optic cable along the rail line, claimed that in the past, hazardous material was often buried on site by BNSF and MRL. He would sometimes plow cable through old derailment sites and find car parts and barrels. But again, neither the video nor any other source proved MRL buried any Alberton spill debris. In early 2000, Chalmers made a formal complaint to the FRA, which interviewed him and investigated the officially empty car BN 561897. Chalmers alleged that MRL transported a rail car containing hazardous material without proper shipping papers and later buried the car on site. FRA's Holgard told Chalmers that the BN car had been released from Klamath Falls on April 2, 1996, empty. It became part of the Alberton train, empty, but Holgard would investigate. The FRA concluded that the BN car was an empty gondola car. According to the FRA report, Chalmers accepted that MRL had not violated any hazardous materials regulations regarding BN 561897. But privately, Chalmers dismissed official claims. Late in 2000, Chalmers still believed a load of caustic soda was compromised from BN 561897 and contributed to acid rain and an exothermic reaction with the chlorine and the cressolate. When presented with facts contradicting one's beliefs, the more entrenched some people became. It didn't help that Chalmers really believed he was the right one to solve this mystery. Chalmers' initial questions were often reasonable, yet he continued to embrace speculative conclusions despite contradictory information. And again, he often exhibited a suspect interpretation of information to begin with. At times, the Chalmers seemed to hear what they wanted to hear. When asked if Martin had confirmed one of their allegations, Ada said yes, but that Martin had said very little. Ada: "He's very subtle when he gives you confirmation. He doesn't go on about it." Roger Chalmers tended to look for and find connections everywhere, and coincidences often seemed like confirmations of his worst suspicions. Something bad had happened, a toxic spill, and it became reasonable to the Chalmers to make speculative connections to explain why and how. Though Roger seemed to get certain facts wrong, and at times his speculation ran wild, I never believed that Chalmers told lies. But he often embraced theories and conclusions that appeared simply not true, and he saw potential conspiracy everywhere. The fundamental claim of the Chalmers that they were exposed to contamination from the spill and suffered injury, I believed was the truth. That truth seemed the foundation for the obsession that drove Roger to try and find out what had happened to his family. Visually disabled, he also had a lot of time on his hands. Chalmers also appeared to have a grandiose opinion of his involvement. When Martin first came to Missoula, Chalmers and Hodges were his main victim contacts, and Chalmers spent a few hours poring over information he had gathered with Martin. Chalmers later recalled from a private conversation with Martin, He told me him and I were going to take this case on personally, and I said, "Why me?" And he goes, "You created the file." "I'm the one that made the allegations to Washington," Chalmers said. He claimed Martin told him, "I was waiting for the right person to come along." During an early evacuee meeting in 1996, Chalmers recalled Chris Weiss standing in the crowd with us instead of up with the board at the podium. Chalmers privately asked why Weiss was not up there with the authorities. He said, "Well, I'm not in agreement with them." He said to me, "It'll take someone like you to straighten this thing out." Chalmers had just met Weiss. "It made me wonder what he knew about me to say that to me," Chalmers said. Chalmers believed his call to the EPA in Washington on April 11 had initiated the EPA Alberton response, and that his later complaints had brought Martin to investigate. Repeatedly, Chalmers believed he was the right person to have come along to ask the right questions and sleuth the right answers, or initiate important investigations. Chalmers did ask important questions and doggedly pursued leads, such as following the contaminated food on the train, that no one else, including government officials, had bothered to check on. Regardless of any possible cover-up, the fact that serious questions arose about the handling and aftermath of the Alberton spill gave reason enough to hear Chalmers out on any lead of his and weigh it on its own merit. Chalmers' allegations were generally taken seriously by fellow core members of ACCEH, though they apparently had not examined his logic. But his story also mattered because of the more questionable allegations he made. Some people already doubted that Chalmers were even exposed up in the 9 Mile. Did their various odd-sounding allegations hurt the credibility of other victims of ACCEH? What did it mean that Roger appeared to have the ear of Robert Martin, the EPA Ombudsman who was investigating victims' complaints after so many years? But while Martin initially received a lot of information and theories from Chalmers, it later became evident that little of it factored in Martin's investigation, which in fact seemed quite limited. By 2000, Chalmers believed that Martin was double-tasked as a special agent. "I'm sure it's CIA or FBI," he said. "He said to me he was tasked to come here. He had to file 8 months before he came here, from the White House. He said he had 2 questions for Chalmers. How did you do this, and will you go the long haul? I said, I am abnormal and I'm honest, and I'm in this for the long haul. I looked at stuff, and when it didn't match, I asked questions, and I pursued until there was some explanation that made sense," Chalmers said. However, in 2000, Roger now admitted, "I don't think it's a conspiracy to cover up by federal agencies anymore. I just think it's the volume that they deal with, and you have to somewhat trust the responsible reporting party. And most of the time it doesn't require a re-scrutinization. And if all the sickness had gone away like they said, it probably never would have been looked at again." His last statement was key to explaining his investigative effort. When I first met Roger Chalmers and listened to his highly involved personal story and investigations, I was open-minded. He was also spill friends with Hodges, a fellow sleuth, which lent him credibility. But with time, I began to question his conclusions and allegations. The best example was his obsession with the gondola car. It wasn't just that all evidence suggested it was in fact an empty car. There was also the stubborn confusion Chalmers had over the basic difference between caustic soda and hydrochloric acid, which he thought one and the same, and which he concluded was carried by this car. And of course, it wouldn't have made much difference if the car had carried either one in actuality, or had even spilled. What had spilled was concern enough. But the main truth of his story boiled down to the truth of many spill victims. They were trying to understand why they were so sick for so long after being told repeatedly by health officials that they should be just fine. That truth was the biggest progenitor of distrust, suspicion, and even conspiracy paranoia that fueled spill victims' investigation into what had happened to them. When Lisa Mosca interviewed the Chalmers at their home, Roger told her he wished he could face the people responsible for what the spill had put him through. "It's like waking up in the Twilight Zone and trying to work your way out," he said. Those who settled because they thought it was just chlorine would like to believe the newspaper, like to believe Dennis Washington and MRL. I'd like to have believed them too and come home and resume my normal life. I tried. When it didn't happen, I had to seek an explanation as to why I couldn't fit back in. There's sickness in that town now that doesn't segregate whether you settled or not. He wished MRL would build a hospital in Alberton and offer free health care for those still ill from the spill. In fact, a clinic seemed like a good idea. Ada, whose father had been a railroad engineer for 30 years with the BN, shared Roger's anger. If they poison the community, they damn well better take care of it, she said. To lie about it is stupid. And for a man who owns this railroad, this is nothing but a toy train to him, she said about Washington. He's so wealthy, it doesn't matter to him. He really doesn't care about the condition of the tracks. I'm not against railroads, I'm just against the way he's running this one. Roger later figured Martin's case would parallel his personal lawsuit. Speaking for the cases unresolved in 2000, Chalmers said, "I don't think any of these victims should get less than $1 million. Still, for him, exposing the truth was paramount. I'll never agree not to show the truth, he said. I don't care how much they settle me for. I'll find some other way to say it." Ada told Martin of Roger, "He's a man of principle, and he will fight to the death. I've seen it. He will not give up." Roger, "Well, I want a clear conscience." But the very next thing Ada said revealed other feelings. "I get so tired. I go, God, I'd like to have a social life. Instead of a life consumed by illness and sleuthing." Chapter 6. Battles. November 1999, Robert Martin met Hodges, the Chalmers, and Dixie Robertson at the 10,000 Silver Dollar Bar 60 miles west of Alberton, near the Idaho border. Their agenda was to strategize. Martin first shared news he thought positive to the Alberton case. In July, a battle with EPA Region 8 escalated into a prize fight. The national EPA versus Bob Martin. The Shattuck waste site in Denver was the arena. "It's a good thing for Alberton because they lost. This clears the way for you guys," Martin told the group in the bar's restaurant. The Shattuck case involved the EPA leaving tons of radioactive waste on an urban site, and of Martin's cases, Region 8 decided to fight this one to the death, he said. The EPA agreed to take the waste out just 2 days earlier. It was important to get Region 8 subdued. It was important to win, he said. Denver had the mayor, governor, a senator, and a representative behind the case, while Alberton had Senator Max Baucus. But Martin thought Alberton would now only have to wage 20% of the fight that Denver had. This past week, Martin also talked to ATSTR and made some suggestions. First, he said, don't make people meet where they can't meet or should not meet. It doesn't work. I'll say so formally. People get ill having to go where you want them to meet. He told ATSTR to set up a safe place or do video conferencing, and then people could really talk. Martin nodded affirmatively to the group. He implied they might get a new CAG if they wanted. There is a window of opportunity with ATSTR as well as with the EPA, he said. It's called fear. Because of the Shattuck case, Colorado Senator Wayne Allard had introduced a bill to strengthen Martin's ombudsman position for 10 years with the EPA and with ATSTR. ATSTR was now willing to do things. This opportunity gives leverage, he said, so use it now. ATSTR only justifies the problems that feed them, Martin said. They keep them going, confirming criticism Hodges had long heard. Elsewhere, Martin told Hodges of ATSTR, they want to run numbers games, using epidemiological science. It takes years and the results are inconclusive. They're going to pour money into doing the epidemiological stuff over years to come and say that they are addressing all the health issues. Martin told ATSTR not to contract any more health testing until the EPA Emergency Response Team did new sampling. The ERT would have the lead on the EPA's protocol. Martin, you need to decide where the samples will be done. The group was thrilled. The victims were asked. He told them to push Region 8 Ombudsman Sonia Pennock for more documents that the EPA may have. With Shattuck, the EPA had told Martin that they couldn't release certain documents. Martin had gone to the chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the U.S. Senate to make Region 8 relent. Now Region 8 can no longer withhold this kind of stuff, he said. The EPA had admitted to backroom deals and meeting with corporate agents past the public comment period. Martin displayed a new cynicism toward Baucus. Leave him alone and shame him, he said. Back off on him. Because he won't sign on because it's the right thing to do. He's not a friend. he's only someone you cornered. The objective is to keep him cornered. When Hodges asked about their homes, Martin suggested they put permanent relocation on the table. By victims raising the issue, the banks would question foreclosing on such property. So the strategy was to write letters, try and get Senator Burns on board, and help write the ERT test sampling plan. Martin, play the documents in the press. Martin didn't realize that his investigations, both in Denver and now in Alberton, had gotten almost no press in Missoula. Martin's involvement confirmed to ACCEH that they weren't just a bunch of crazies railing against the government. The EPA Ombudsman himself was highly critical of the EPA and ATSDR, and made clear that forces worked against the welfare of people beyond mere bureaucratic indifference and bungling. Now you're prepared to move out, Martin concluded. It's going to be rough, but you're prepared to fight and able to fight a better fight. For Robert Martin, Denver had been his high noon. During decades of chemical processing, the 6-acre Shattuck chemical site in urban residential Denver was contaminated with uranium, radium, and heavy metals. In 1992, the EPA abruptly reversed their original decision to remove the soil and decided to create an on-site 15-foot-high capped monolith, despite residents' fears of contaminated groundwater. The site was expected to be a health hazard for 16,000 years. Residents wanted the waste removed and spent 5 years petitioning Region 8 EPA to review the decision, only to be denied. They claimed the EPA held information about the site in secret. After residents appealed to Republican Senator Wayne Allard in 1998, he became outraged when the EPA refused to conduct a public hearing. Allard held up confirmation of Superfund Program Director and National EPA Assistant Administrator Tim Fields until he got a guarantee of an independent investigation by Martin. The EPA capitulated. In September 1999, Martin held his first public hearing to air his findings and gather testimony. The director of the ERT dropped the bombshell that the Shattuck site cap, designed to last 200 years, would likely fail within 5 to 15 years. Furthermore, the cost of monitoring would likely equal the cost of removal. The EPA had originally cited Shattuck's refusal to bear the cost of removal in justifying the monolith. The Ombudsman hearing brought tearful testimony from residents who said this was the first time anyone from EPA took their concerns seriously. One woman testified that the Shattuck experience of being lied to and then ignored by the EPA destroyed her trust in government. As a result of his own Shattuck experience, Senator Allard introduced in October 1999 legislation to reauthorize the office of the EPA Ombudsman, which had expired in 1989 but kept on as EPA policy, and make it more independent. The Ombudsman's investigation brought integrity back into the process, Allard told Congress later. Without the Ombudsman's work, a trusted federal agency would have been able to successfully hide the truth from the very people it is charged to protect. Currently, Martin got his budget through the EPA and reported to Assistant Administrator Fields. Allard's proposed Ombudsman Reauthorization Act provided the office with its own budget, and the Ombudsman would report to Congress. Allard warned that the EPA was attempting to restructure the office and curtail Ombudsman power, and Martin acknowledged the EPA had tried to tell him what cases he could investigate. Shattuck had reverberated to the highest levels of the EPA. Martin later charged the EPA of convening a special task force comprised of representatives from all the regional offices, the Office of General Counsel, and the Office of Inspector General. The task force developed guidelines to restrict the independence of the National Ombudsman function, he said. The EPA versus Martin played out in the court of D.C. politics. Critics of the EPA, such as the Project on Government Oversight, claim the agency often cut deals with polluters. Citizens relied on the Ombudsman as their only recourse. In the Denver Post, Allard charged in an editorial that the EPA reversed its original decision to remove the waste following a secret meeting between Shattuck's attorneys, the EPA, and the Colorado Department of Health. Allard said Martin uncovered documents hidden from the public, and as a result, the National EPA administration under Carol Browner now sought to eliminate Martin's office. The existence of many documents was previously unknown because the EPA originally declared the index of privileged documents itself as privileged. At the end of October, Martin recommended removal of the waste. Just before Martin met with Alberton victims in November, Fields announced a revisit to the Shattuck decision, which Martin and the media interpreted as certain removal of the waste. Allard called the Denver activist residents true heroes in every sense of the word. They took on the EPA, the state of Colorado, and Citigroup and won. Their successful fight to regain their neighborhood has made them a role model for other communities around this country that are engaged in similar battles with EPA, Allard wrote. Martin characterized most of his cases as bureaucratic mistakes by the EPA, but sometimes he discerned environmental injustice, a lack of regard for the community involved, if not outright contempt. Shattuck was one such instance. Martin's battle over Shattuck served to reinforce distrust over the EPA handling of Alberton. Not only could the EPA make big mistakes, they could conspire with the polluter at the cost of threatening the health of residents, and then lie about it. Though his Shattuck battle appeared at an end, the fallout would threaten the very existence of Martin's office. If Hodges thought Shattuck reflected failure to protect the public interest, what transpired in Libby, Montana was a nightmare. In late 1999, the Libby asbestos story exploded like a time bomb, much the way the disease asbestosis did. But the appalling truth was this story had been ignored by everyone, the state, the EPA, the media, for years and years and years. In a perverse way, Libby gave hope to some Alberton victims. If the indisputable asbestos horrors of Libby could be ignored, perhaps it bolstered the case that Alberton complainers weren't just a bunch of greedy litigants, and their story could make its way out from under its rock of official apathy. Ironically, it appeared that the only reason the Libby story broke at all was because of pending litigation. At least one community activist said she'd been crying murder since 1974. By 2001, she had lost 20 relatives to asbestos-related disease. The Montana Environmental Information Center and the Montana AFL-CIO said they'd known about such deaths for 15 years and could get no one to listen, especially the media. The government at all levels knew of the situation, but took no action, an MEIC spokesperson said. After Libby broke, Hodges was hopeful, cynical, and not surprised. All the agencies claimed they had done what they were supposed to do, yet the crisis was somehow ignored. I think it's the way they're interpreting their mandates to do as little as possible rather than do what the mandate says, Hodges said. After a Baucus hearing in Libby in February 2000, which Roger Chalmers attended, he commented to Hodges on the 40 years of anger he felt from the crowd. One person who stood up to talk was so mad that he couldn't talk, Chalmers said. The man's whole family had been affected, and he paced back and forth in front of the microphone, unable to get out the words, clouded in rage. Baucus shut the hearing down as people's anger crescendoed. Afterwards, Chalmers asked Baucus privately for an Alberton hearing and invited him to come to his home and the homes of others, as Baucus had done in Libby. He gave Baucus a copy of Lisa Mosca's film. "I want him to break bread with us, eat with us, to bring him in one more notch," Chalmers said. Maybe Baucus could visit the site during the spring thaw when the smell rose. Baucus seemed to balk at the invitations. Baucus never made any public statements about Alberton, in the manner he did for Libby or in the manner Senator Allard did over Shattuck when he called upon Martin's help. Regardless of excuses over what happened in Libby, to Hodges and others, there could be no question that officials knew about complaints from Alberton. The question remained, who cared? Some Alberton victims evoked Libby when they again wrote the EPA or appealed to Baucus for a hearing, also mindful that Conrad Burns was running for re-election. If something as cut and dried as Libby and asbestos could fall through the cracks, maybe the revelation could boost the credibility of the settler scenario of Alberton. But one Libby man said they hadn't fallen through the cracks. Rather, government agencies had shoved them into the cracks. If Libby could be forgotten, how much easier to keep on forgetting Alberton, where no ubiquitous oxygen tanks shadowed victims. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. ATSCR releases the results of its Phase 2 study, which, despite its limitations, documents chronic injury in Alberton spill victims. Meanwhile, the EPA declares war on the EPA National Ombudsman Robert Martin, threatening his Alberton case. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.